We want to for as long as we can. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whichever part of the world that you're joining us from. My name is Chandani Jaswal. I'm a core team member here at Karma Heritage, and this is a special guest lecture series for Beyond the Myth 2.0. We're very honored and delighted to have Professor Smita Sahgal join us for a lecture tonight. Professor Smita Sahgal is a professor of history at the Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi University. Her primary area of research interest is ancient India history with a focus on gender studies and religion. She's authored several books, which include Niyog, Alternative Mechanism of Lineage Perpetuation, a socio-historical inquiry, which was published in 2017, Transdisciplinarity and the Bhagavad Gita, Synthesizing Ethics with Pragmatism, which came out in 2024, Hunting and Dicing, where leisure intersected with masculine aspirations in early India, among many others. And when I say the word among many others, I mean it. We'll share the link with you, and you can see ma'am has written a prolific number of articles, especially on the importance of epics and how we situate them. And it's a lecture, ma'am, that all of us have eagerly been looking forward to. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Professor Sehgal would be speaking to us on the following topic. The title of the lecture is Excavating History from the World of Mythical Narratives, Glimpses from Rik Samhita, Mahabharat, and Skand Puran. We're very, very excited, like I said, ma'am, and without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandani. Thank you for that longish introduction. But here I need to correct a little bit. And that is, well, I wrote Niyog as a book. I've written Teaching History as another co-authored book. But the other two that you talked about are articles in different books. So, and there are many other articles. I mean, I think I've been around more than 40 articles. So, and another book is in the process of emergence. so,
And as many
so
book chapters, ma'am. I mean, there are a lot of book chapters also in.
many book chapters, many articles. Well, there are also articles in newspapers and magazines. But right now, the focus is is going to be on excavating history from world of mythical narratives, glimpses from Rik Samhita and the Mahabharata and the Skanda Puran. But there, I must also thank your initiative, Karwa, Ishan in particular, and you too. I think there's a good growing team right now. I have been a part of it, friends, for a long time, and I get yet another opportunity. What I really like about your initiative is an effort to link up with people across, not the space itself, but otherwise also in terms of the interest. For instance, there are times that you have lectures that are for lay audience, and times you have lectures for very specialist, specialized, those who have some expertise in an area. So the attempt to link up with so many people around is worth an applause. Congratulations, Team Karwa. That is something that I wanted to, in fact, start my lecture with. And as I tell you, this is a work which I am. This is also a work in progress, by the way. What I am going to discuss today is something that I'm planning to eventually give a shape to in form of writing. It could be article, bunch of articles, I don't know. So talking about it to all of you has a purpose. I want some kind of a feedback. I can fine tune this further. Now, through this presentation, I would like to share my understanding of myths, how we use them as a source, and share the methodology of culling history out of myths or mythical narratives. So, friends, what I would like to do right now is to give you a broad format of how I will proceed, exactly the way I do it in a classroom. I break my lecture into different segments, and I tell everybody what is going to be the structure of my lecture. So I'm going to start first with a broad definition of myth, and what do we understand by myth, what is mythos, what is logos, then how these are being utilized across various disciplines, not just history, but others, which means that I'm going to look into, varied explanations about it and come to the basic query how myths can be used for historical interrogation. I start looking at these three myths, Rik Samhita, the Mahabharata, and Skanda Puran. Now, even these kind of myths, the myths that I've chosen, actually, for a student of history, it's not difficult to understand that they are on a very wide canvas, very, very wide canvas in terms of its temporal expansion, also in terms of the areas where these became popular. Somewhere around 1000 BCE, because I'm looking at the 10th mandal of the Rig Samhita, going right up to the 14th, 15th century CE. So that's the expanse. And one would wonder, why do I choose to take such a huge expanse, which would actually reflect very diverse social formations. So the continuity of myth would have a very different rationale. The reason why I picked up these myths was primarily of a thematic coherence. I'm actually looking myths that deal with samvads or dialogues, but these dialogues are a part of intimate conversations. So these are largely in a familial setting between husband and wife, brother and sister, but also reflect on how developments would take place in the society at large, because they are also actually a part of ritual performance and impact a larger social milieu. So I would start by narrating, of course, the myth and try and analyze it from a sociological perspective, from a gender perspective, whatever I can get. The intention is to basically locate them on a historical scale. So I remain true to my discipline. I'm a student of history, and I remain that. So I have to understand how myths can be interpreted over a period of time, and if I can read fluctuations within it. So I would also outline how I plan to present my ideas. This is going to be a combination of reading some parts, which I have, some parts which I penned down, some parts which are a part of myths. So I just have to narrate those myths and then also talk to you. So it's going to be a combination of the two. And because it's going to be a longish session, so we'll definitely get time where we are going to have interaction. And as I mentioned, that this would be an occasion for me to get a feedback and improve my own work. This is what I did. In fact, something on the same lines I spoke even in Delhi History Congress a couple of months back. I got fantastic feedback from there. And in one of the myths that I am going to narrate, I have actually incorporated the changes that I could bring in as a result of interaction with people around. So I start now with my introduction. What is it that we mean by myth? I think you've had a number of lectures on what this is, a section primarily on myth. So you have understood what myth is. In our everyday parlance, myth is taken as something that is not true, something that is associated with falsehood or, fanciful stories, figment of imagination. So the whole idea is that we call something a myth, which we are actually dismissing in favor of a rational thought. That is the way we understand it, becomes synonymous with a fallacy. But if we go back into the genesis of the term myth, I think you're familiar about with it by now. We know that myth has come from the term mythos. Mythos is a Greek term, and in the Greek language, it actually refers to something very authoritative, which is unquestioned knowledge. It stands as a contrast to logos, which will actually denote something that is logical, that is a part of a structured argument. So that is how mythos and logos would get contrasted. In a classical sense, a myth then is a part of a traditional story whose factual accuracy is not there and need not be proved. So it's something that talks about, in terms of, say, Greek myth, this is what Polo said, and you will have to agree with it. There's no question of verification or class or cross verification. And as Habermas puts it, and Habermas is actually talking about modernity, he's talking on discourse of modernity, but he understands the power of myth and he calls it something that is deeply tied to authoritarian norm of tradition. And from this perspective, and it's a very fairly critical perspective, myths can be seen as a set of culturally sanctioned narratives that shape and reinforce collective identity without being subjected to any scrutiny. They don't have to be. Now, logos is a contrast to that. It actually refers to a rational inquiry, which is grounded in empirical observation and very logical argumentation. Now, if we go back in terms of history, go to the period in the 18th century, the late 18th century, we know that the Enlightenment movement had started. Now, the Enlightenment movement of the 18th century also was a very important point for us, students of history, because it is the time when history as a discipline emerged and it was understood as a logos driven pursuit, which basically means that it began distancing itself from yet another discipline, that of theology. Those of us who have studied medieval European history would understand with ease that during the medieval time, history was almost an adjunct to theology. They were almost interchangeable. You know, whenever you wanted to prove a theory or a story, a theological story, you would rake up some historical evidence for it. But that is what came to an end. You know, entire Rankenian movement is driven towards that. Starts with what we understand as positivism. But coming back to the basic question that worries us here is that uh, there seemingly lies a tension between mythos and logos. And this tension seems unresolved because at the time when Ranke was talking about history, he would have dismissed myths as actually figments of imagination. But with the passage of time, many social scientists have begun thinking, are myths and logos fundamentally opposed? Or should the scholars in the world of humanities and social sciences engage with myths, you know, analytically engage with myths, or should they reject myths altogether? That's a big question that comes to their mind. Now, answering this question basically implies that we also try and take a look at the way in which myths have been. Um, uh, there is somebody who needs to be admitted. Can I just? Okay. Myths that need that you know uh, how these myths have been analyzed in different disciplines, because we historians definitely draw on a number of disciplines to have a fairly holistic view of what happened in past. So I come to the first, the section, another section of my presentation, and that deals with the different views of scholars. I start with how myths are understood in the world of phenomenology. And we have scholars, the phenomenologists of religion, you know, scholars like Gerardus Liu and Mircea Eliade have understood myths in a certain way. But before that, what is phenomenology of religion? It's basically, of course, a sympathetic understanding of religion, a tradition in which the conscious experiences of an individual are given a lot of space. So it's an understanding. The experiences may differ, but they are taken at their face value. So phenomenologists like Liu and Iliade look at myth as something extremely sacred. So the events that are narrated within the myth are called holy. They have a holy nature. The sacred message is conveyed symbolically, and the story dramatically addresses origin or transformation. So the two words, key words that are there in this kind of understanding is the story of origin. So we are really talking about primeval myths and the transformation that has happened. So in that sense, myths within this context is something very, very distinct and different from an ordinary story or a legend, a popular folklore, where changes may come in at people's will. But this narration of myth itself is a very pious exercise. Now, psychologists like Jung, C.J. Jung, I think who had written about this way back in 1916 in one of his very famous essays, he connected myths to the concept of what is called collective unconscious, which he defines as a shared unconscious inheritance common to all. all human beings, and these manifest in forms of archetypes. What are archetypes? These are universal symbols and themes which belong to humanity per se. So he's looking at the social aspect definitely, but what he says is uh, telling and retelling of myth, or the selection of symbols and the performance of these myths in the ambit of a particular ritual is not just a sociological or a social phenomenon, it is as much a psychological phenomenon. Friends, I came across this theory many, many years back when I was working on my doctoral thesis on cults of the bull. And that's when I realized, one second. And that's when I realized that when you talk about bull cults, I was looking at practices in the context of India, but I was also looking at some of the practice, ancient India, I'm looking at what happened in Greece, that is in Crete or in Egypt, in Mesopotamia. And I definitely came across certain practices common to all without these civilizations ever having any kind of an exchange of ideas. So it did puzzle me that why, something like sacrifice of bull, why does this happen? So that's when I started reading Jung's work and I understood this idea of collective unconscious and sometimes performance of rituals within recalling of myth and its performance within the ritual context may bring about some kind of assuaging of an unsettled mind. It can be a very cathartic exercise. If we have time in the Q&A session, then I'll talk about a very famous myth of the myth of double acts, which is there in the Cretan Minoan civilization. And if you get to know what it entails, you can understand how cathartic the entire exercise was. Now, compared to these two sets of scholars, structural anthropologists like Claude Levi-Strauss, whose very famous work, The Savage Mind, is, a seminal piece. He argues that the defining nature of a mythical thought is in its concreteness. There's something very definitive that it is doing. Myths make use of signs that lie between images on one side and concept on the other side. So the signs are concrete like images, but their reference power aligns them to concepts. So myth makers like bricolage artists, that's a term of artists who make use of all the material that is there before them to express something metaphorically. They construct their cosmologies from the cultural fragments available to them, and these fragments then represent much more than the surface meaning. For example, an animal in the myth may actually symbolize a range of ideas other than itself, the animal. And again, I would say that I came to identify with this very easily because when I was studying on bull cults, I realized bull came to symbolize not just itself, bull actually could be easily a symbol of masculinity, of strength, of power, of regality, of even association with the populace and love. There were a whole range of ideas it could stand for. And of course, it was a very important or useful animal as well. So, through the metaphor of bull, I was also reading something else. Just to give you an example, in the Mahabharata, you would find that Yudhishthir is often referred to as the bull of the Bharatas. So, obviously, it's the leadership quality that gets highlighted. So the term bull is then being frequently used, and it's not standing for the animal, but for other range of ideas. A historian of mythology can definitely benefit from the insights of Didi Kosambi. Now, Didi Kosambi is very, very important for us, friends. We have to understand that. What is it that Didi Kosambi tells us? For Kosambi, myths and rituals reflect the evolution of societies into larger productive communities. This is important. I'm just going to paraphrase a little from his work. He says, the fossilized and the stratified elements of certain rituals along with the mythical telling and systems like caste and religion can bind a group together, shaping their interactions with other groups in a diverse society. So in this view, myth and ritual enactment then can act as identity marker. So The fact that you belong to a certain community means that a certain ritual will be performed at certain point in time, and there would be a recall through a myth, and everybody would be a part of it. That is how your identity will get reinforced time and again. Now, the transformation, the expansion, and the omissions in the myth is very crucial to understand diverse social and historical processes for us. Myth, in that sense, can be viewed as a historical document that has been layered over through centuries, and each layer reveals a very distinct history with a special within a special spatial and temporal format. And it has been correctly said that the myth is like palimpsest on which each generation has inscribed its own layer of message. So, what is the responsibility of a historian interrogator is to decode it. And as students of history, we are actually trained to do that. And that is why at times we object to people who are not specialists in history, but when they comment about it, because history is a discipline, is a professional discipline also, and history is also something that can belong to anybody. So when you do not have that kind of training to do it, then you may not be able to understand the nuances of deconstruction and reconstruction. Now, decoding each layer would require what we say is a toolbox approach, an interpretive approach. Toolbox basically refers to studying a myth from diverse, vantages, making use of different, one second, another different sociological tools, and basically giving a view that is far more holistic. You're really looking at a very holistic view. As a student of history, I think, and many of you are students of history, many of you are interested in history, friends, a historian is supposed to provide as many approaches, as many advantages and interpretation as possible before siding with one or two, whatever it is. But you have to take cognizance of all. And if you're not siding with those views, you also have to give a reason or rationale behind it. So I return to my primary question. Can a historian benefit from studying myth? Yes, the answer is clearly affirmative. Uh, the story within the myth, and I must say, can be, there's a possibility that it is not empirically correct, because all myths have aspects of fantasy attached to them. There is an element of fantasy which a student of history is trained to gradually see, segregate fantasy from plausible historical facts, and then try and reconstruct phase in history. See what the myth can actually tell, even if it is not exact, even if I don't believe in an exact date, but I do believe that a myth can reflect a plausible social fabric and similar events of the time when it was composed. Once the broad time and a spatial canvas has been ascertained, and this is done through various tools of philology, that could be, how you read the language, its connection with the social milieu, and so on. Once we have done that, we gain an insight into the social formation of the myth study, and then draw very broad generalizations. So, what I'm trying to say is that the study of myths can price up of plausible social historical reality, and then it's the duty of the historian investigator to piece things together. But even in doing that, as I say, you are provided with the training, so you're told how to do it. One of the things that you would be asked to do is to look for cross verification. So if you believe in something, ye hua hoga, this might have happened in the past, well, we'll believe it happened in the past once we get cross verification through epigraphic source, through numismatics, some other literary evidence. So, cross verification or corroboration is an integral part of our being able to ascertain its truth. But otherwise, what we say is that we are not sure whether that event happened if it is as distant as, say, the Mahabharata war. Just to give you an example, because well, there are some some institutes that are they're trying to ascertain the date when the Mahabharat war was fought, and there are others who just dismisses it as just a simple myth. I would take a view somewhere in middle, and I would say that the interclannish wars were very common in the later Vedic period, the period that we say was the genesis associated with the Mahabharata between 1000 to 500 BCE. We talk about that, but it is plausible somewhere around that time. But what was the exact date and exact space, we may not be able to confirm, but we agree to the fact that these interfamilial, interclannish skirmishes would happen, because we also know that something like a Mahabharata war, which is there just within, fought, if we were to look at the space also, say between Indraprasth, Delhi, and Hastinapur, Meerut, it takes a pan-Indian phenomenon in terms of format, and this is done only through the process of adding more and more material to it through annotation. So, what I'm just trying to suggest is that something, if the question before me is, did Mahabharat happen the way it has been explained in the Mahabharat text? I would take it with a pinch of salt, but I would agree to the fact that, wars and battles and skirmishes of that level were a very common feature in societies that were pastoralist, or that were in the process of transiting from pastoralism to agriculture and settled existence, even the emergence of state societies. Okay, I come now to yet another part of my presentation, and that deals with what I call a concept clarification. What is it that I am clarifying? I'm clarifying my views on the samvad or conversation that happened, because I'm going to pick up those conversations, and especially I'm picking up, as I said, intimate conversations in a myth. So I'm going to talk a little about what is the conversation in a myth and what is conversation analysis. Both these things, because, and here I am making, this is a toolbox box approach. I'm making use of sociology and social works of sociologists to understand this. Now, a conversation is clearly a dialogic exchange where two, and there are times more than two. In fact, one of the epics that, one of the myths that I have taken into account talks about that also, where two or more people share their ideas, information, emotions through speech, through gestures, or any other form of expression. It usually follows a pattern, a very interactive, dynamic pattern, where participants will take turns to speak and respond. So there is a dialogue, there's somebody speaking first, the other is responding, a third person may also enter into that. Now, in a myth, a conversation refers to a dialogue or exchange of words between characters such as gods, heroes, and mythical beings. Again, the element of fantasy has come in. And as I say, we have to learn to segregate that. These conversations often play a crucial role in revealing essential aspects of the story, and reflect the values, beliefs, and cultural practices of the society where this particular myth was composed. Now, most of the time, I mean, sometimes the exchange may be at the surface, a very normal clarificatory exchange is taking place, but there are times when exchanges are often symbolic, they convey deeper meanings beyond a literal exchange of words, and that is where the role of historian comes in, that you are able to read between lines. Now, coming to the other part of it, what is conversation analysis? Because I'm precisely going to do conversation analysis in the of the myths, so we should understand theoretically what it means. I have actually used works of Garfinkel in this to understand what it is. It refers to a unique method of studying social interactions, and it focuses, amongst other things, on the context. There are a couple of things on the context of the conversation, the sequential pattern, action formation, non-verbal use, cues, and even repair mechanisms. So there are a couple of aspects that are taken into account, all of which work as a guide to understanding human behavior in a larger social context. So, when Garfinkel and other scholars started working on this, they were really looking, they were definitely not looking at the myths. They were looking at, their spaces were rural exchanges or urban exchanges. And they started with very casual conversations, but then they realized that even the casual conversations could actually give very deep insight in the process of thinking. So that is how they started formalizing a theory around it. Okay, friends. I come now to the conversation, the first conversation that I'm taking into account, and that relates to the myth of Yama and Yami in the Rig Samhita. This particular myth comes in the 10th mandal of Rig Samhita, which we students of history take it as much later development. Generally, we understand it is beginning of the later Vedic period around 1000 BCE. And this is a myth that deals with the conversation between twins Yama and Yami and is extremely interesting because of its larger social implication. So let me read some passages out of it. Now, Yami, the sister, here insists that her brother, uh, sorry, uh, insists that her brother cohabits with her to have a son. And what does she say? Quote, let thy soul and mine be knit together, as loving take me thy concert. Unquote. She further says that the love of Yama possesses I, Yami, I may rest on the same couch beside him. One of Yami's arguments for having this kind of a sexual relationship with her brother was that Twashter, again, this is in quote, Twashter, the creator, made us a married couple while in the womb. Right, that is before we were born, we were already a married couple, and heaven and earth acknowledged that. Now, this she is obviously making a reference to the twinness. What is the brother's reaction? Yama is prudish, he is moralistic, and possibly scared also. And he reminds her that gods are watching. And he says, shall we do what we have never done before? For how can we who speak the truth utter that is false? Now, this is very important because this is a statement that also makes Yama, also associates Yama as the speaker of the truth. So he is the speaker of the truth now, and he points out that gods are watching. He says, "Great is the law of Varun and Mitra. What will you say to men to tempt them, O Yami?" So he's angry with the sister. He hints at Rita. What is Rita? Rita in the Rig Vedic and the Vedic tradition is a reference to moral order. Now he hints at that and says gods have put it across to regulate human behavior. But Yami defends her cause by pointing out that such license are standard among the immortals, and the law principles are only meant for the mortals. So she says that we are cut above others. She even hints at the ancient case of Brahma, who had taken, who'd become a husband to his daughter Saraswati, a myth that will continue right into the Purans also. But Yama, ever conscious of their relationship, refuses to acknowledge the veracity of this idea, and she retorts. What does she say? Quote, is he a brother whose sister has no lord? Is she a sister whose brother's misfortune approaches? Overcome by desire, I strongly urge this one request: unite thy person with mine. Unquote. By the way, I've taken all these passages from Griffith's work, Hymns of Rigved, the 10th Mandal, the English translation. So she's so angry with him, and she says she almost threatens him that your misfortune is approaching because you are denying me what is legitimately mine. But he calls this particular desire a sin. Further, he acknowledges that some might resort to this now and even in the future, but that he will not buckle under any pressure. He implores her to find a husband outside. Go outside, Yami, and look for a husband. His will prevails. And Yami ends by exclaiming, you weakling, you really are a weakling, Yama. We get to know that cohabitation does not happen. Now, as student of history, we are supposed to decode it. So we look at the interpretations. How do we interpret this intimate conversation? At a fundamental level, the myth adequately establishes that incest as a practice existed at some point in time in the antiquity, but now was the time to create a taboo against it. So it was losing its popular ground. Yummy quite effectively refers to an earlier common practice that sanctioned marriages between twins, and she warns Yama against infringing such a custom. She understands his resistance as an unbrotherly act whose protection she had sought the protection of her brother, and he's not giving him that. However, the words of Yama actually spelt a social change. The need for exogamous marriages becomes very, very clear. And Yama says that this kind of a relationship probably exists in some areas and may continue for some time, but it would definitely be sidelined. Well, the redactors of the text of that particular day, they clearly hinting at proscribing the practice of relationship between brother and sister. In other words, incest becomes a taboo. Clearly, it becomes a taboo. Now, as students of history, we are supposed to investigate the rationale behind the emergence of this taboo and its social formation also. We are actually talking of a society which was largely pastoral or practiced early agriculture, the Rigvedic society, which was also organized between amongst various clans and Vish. Now, by the later Vedic time, caste stratification would emerge. Land would gradually become the bone of contention, and issues like its occupation, inheritance would also emerge. And that is when we would realize that the society needed to streamline certain social practices. The issue or the institution of marriage based on exogamy would emerge. Now, there are some queries that have come up, and these are the queries that come from some scholars who try to understand whether the myth of brother sister cohabiting can be associated with the origin myth. That means the two cohabit to populate the word, and does the conversation also reveal any personal psychological dimension of human thinking, where now you start creating cultural devices to proscribe the practice. There are scholars like Roth and Keith who understand this as an origin myth where Yami, the sister, is the first woman and Yama is the first man, and they come together in order to create the world. But but and that this remains a part of a memory is recalled and in the context of Akhyan or ritual time and again. This is again something very interesting. By the way, we have clearly told that this particular uh, myth is a part of a ritual enactment, which is a part of Akhyan. Akhyan is a drama. That means you are actually performing. It's like a stage performance happening. And we can imagine we're talking about tribal society and two or three people are a part of just two people are part of it because they're just entering into a dialogue. And there's a whole, they're encircled by people who are watching this. So, and becoming a part of it, it might be a matter of recalling a myth and reinforcing the idea now that incest has become a taboo and you must not practice it. So the genre of this particular myth is also to be taken into account. So the question again, coming back to the question, can it be associated with the origin myth? Even when Roth and Keith are talking about, there are other scholars like Max Muller who do not subscribe to it. Even Grivet doesn't subscribe to it because what Max Muller says that within the Vedas, at least, not a single word points to there being the first couple. But if we uh, transfer our attention to the Avestan tradition, Zen Avesta, which is something that has come up in in the domain of Iran, Persia, we find that Yima is mentioned, both brother and sister are mentioned, though by a number of names, sometimes Misha, sometimes Mishani, and definitely they are the first couple. There it is a part of an origin myth. So, as one of the scholars, A.E. Christensen, tells us, who studied a lot of Western literature, he tells us there's a possibility that this myth that had become very popular in Persia carried on when these people moved towards the Indian terrain, Indian subcontinent, that terrain. There's a possibility that it carried on as a part of what may be referred to as, a historical memory. And so it was enacted time and again. So there is possibility that this myth had originated. The story of Yama Yami came up earlier, but then it received a different dimension and a different modification in the continent, in the in the Indian subcontinent. It received a different kind of a molding. Now, if we turn our attention to what sociologists have to say, we can easily make out that there are scholars like McLennan and Durkheim, though they're not talking particularly about this myth, but they're talking about how this incest taboo emerges. And this myth is almost like a historical, documentation of that. So, McLennan and Durkheim postulate the existence of what they refer to as a promiscuous horde in the evolutionary stages of human existence. That is, we are talking about the band society. When people are moving one place to another, there'll be 10 or 20 people living together, and then they are moving on. So, in that particular stage, he's using the term promiscuous horde, which means uh, men and women establish relations amongst themselves in that band setup. But gradually, the concept of exogamy must have come up. Now, exogamy is a term that actually has been coined by McLennan, and it denotes the marrying out of one's uh, kin group or tribe, and endogamy is marrying within that. He speculated, that is, McLennan speculated, that exogamy emerged when hostilities existed within and between various tribes. Now, what would be the reason for that hostility? It could be over possession of, one of the reasons for the hostility could be possession of the female, which may actually lead also to polyandry, existence of polyandry. And this is a view which is also supported by Malinowski, who proposed that exogamy was essentially an extension of the incest taboo, designed to discourage mating amongst close relatives. Malinowski was actually writing in order to challenge the work of Westermarck. Westermarck has written a seminal work um, on the history of the institution of marriage. I don't remember the exact title, but somewhere around that. And he said that when children are brought up together, they develop, they won't ever enter into sexual relationships because their feelings become very controlled, and there is a theory which he propounds, the theory of inbreeding avoidance, which also, in that, if they are living together from the very beginning, uh, it's imprinted in their minds that they can't enter into sexual relationships. This is a kind of a theory which is given by Westermarck, but this is a theory that has been actually challenged by psychologists and sociologists both. If you talk about psychologists, one of the persons who has actually challenged that is Sigmund Freud, because Sigmund Freud says that in a nuclear family, when children, girls and boys, are growing up together and they enter the adolescent phase, then there is a natural attraction amongst them. Therefore, in order to avoid this kind of relationship to come up, what is important is the creation of a cultural device and their socialization right from the childhood, about the idea that the daughters, the girls within this family, will be married outside. They will establish sexual relationships outside, and the boys will get another girl from another setup into the house. So that is something which he says has this process of socialization has to start very, very early. Now, this is a view where I feel the sociologists, psychologists, and even anthropologists concur. All of them agree to this because even structuralists like Levi Strauss reasoned that mating would have been unrestrained in early hunting gathering band societies until several bands and band alliances were formed. These alliances uh, would have been structured on the principle of reciprocity. So, food and other goods were a part of this exchange, but females must have been the most precious resource of reciprocal exchange. Whenever these, tribes would come together in some kind of for some kind of ritual performance, those would be the occasion when they would be exchanging their goods also, and those would also be the time when the females would be exchanged. And according to Levi Strauss, this a cultural rule had to be created that required all adult males to seek pleasure outside their natal band, and this with passage of time would lead to the principle of exogamy, uh, basically to marry outside. Now, coming back to our myth on yama and yami, what we find is that the Vedic poets attempted to create this norm, uh, that is incest taboo, in very clear moralistic terms. But there's a possibility that the whole idea of saying that it would be a sinful exercise may actually also serving a very pragmatic requirement, because when you give your daughter away, remember you're creating another nexus, another relationship nexus. So when you give your daughters away, and there are occasions when the daughter would come back, you are actually expanding your social network, which could also be a trade network. So there is a possibility that it was done deliberately to avoid conflict within the household over the appropriation of affection of the females on one side. On the other hand, it was a deliberate attempt to expand your social and economic network. But what is very clear is, and then that also explains why Yama tells Yami, go outside and look for a husband. That means create a network outside. This short myth suggests a transitory social formation from an egalitarian band or early tribal setup to a more settled patriarchal tribal setting. There's no doubt about it that the Vedic society was androcentric. The Vedic society was very, very patriarchal and patrilineal. But I have also tried to understand this myth from another perspective, that is a gender perspective. You and I understand the fact that there came a point in time when the incest taboo had to come up so that tensions within the clan had to be stopped, and that there was a possibility of expanding your nexus outside. We understand that it has to be there. But my question is that in this particular myth, why is the blame put on the shoulders of the female character? If you look carefully, read the lines over and over again, you'd find Yami is the one who's shown with an unregulated sexual desire, and Yama is somebody who's shown as the wiser between the two, who tries to regulate this practice. For me, it was a very dangerous trend that was established. It could have been the other way around also. I mean, Yama could have asked for the sexual favor and Yami could have stopped, but that does not happen. And by not doing that, what the redactors did, mythographers did, was to create a notion of unrestrained sexual desire of women for generations and generations to come across. You find this in Manusmriti, you find this in the Jatak tales, where the entire blame is put on women and the need to regulate them comes up. You find that in the works of Vidyapati in the 15th century, much later when he's writing Purush Pariksha, he's putting a lot of blame on women and that the need to control them is there. You find that when you study the social reform movement of the 19th century, Vidyasagar, one an individual actually goes in for he makes a plea for widow remarriage, especially of child widows, because he also of course that was a reform that he'd undertaken, but one of the reasons that he gives is that if you don't do that, then as these girls grow up, because of their inherent sexual desire, they may waylay many men. So this a notion that was put back, in place around 1000 BCE is continuing down, I think, even till this time in the 21st century. So the Vedic, but there's another aspect to it which I must highlight, that the Vedic poets definitely acknowledge the intelligent persuasions of Yami, gives us a clue that women had voice at that point in time. So we're looking at largely a tribal setup where women are at least able to put across their voice. Their arguments are clear, they're backed by historical memory, divine wisdom, and an unabashed acknowledgement of her desire to procreate with her brothers. So she's able to argue all this. To that an extent, one must acknowledge that Vedic poets gave her, iota of autonomy, uh, but and also the fact that she gets the last word. She's berating him as, you weakling, you really are a weakling, Yama. But having said that, finally she's cut to size and the will of Yama prevails. But that inside, the little peep into a society which was egalitarian at one point in time and women could speak their minds out, at least becomes clear in this particular myth. Now, I want to look at the larger implication of the myth. Well, the myth is meant to give to bring it to an end, to bring the practice of incest to an end. But was incest ultimately censured? uh, we get to know that was not entirely the claim. That was not entirely what happened. We have at least two instances within the Vedic literature that give us an idea of the continuation of the practice of incest. Pushan's love for his mother is not just the love of son, it's more than that. Or even Brahma Saraswati's sexual union also borders on incest. But definitely, these are two examples. Some other examples, okay, but definitely the practice was getting sidelined. Incest was becoming a taboo. But if the incest was becoming a taboo, I would like to also understand what happens to the principal characters who make us aware of the fact that that once upon a time the practice was in existence and then the effort to sideline it comes up. I'm talking of Yama and Yami. What happens to these two characters in later myths? Why I say that? Because as I mentioned, something that comes in the Veda carries on in the epics, may carry on further in Puranas, which are later in time. So there is a possibility of um, there is a possibility of carrying on with the myths. And when we study these myths and we study these myths over time and space, we are actually able to infer historical fluctuations through that. Now, so what happens to Yama and Yami in future myths? Now, and how do they figure in the later literature? Yama remains in the minds of mythographers. In fact, he remains in the minds of people like us till this date. That he resisted an incestuous relationship would help him with reward of longevity within the mythical format, though he dies. Otherwise, he would die in later literature and will be revived as the god of death. But he's there in all the myths subsequently. However, he may have been pushed low in the hierarchy because he participated in an intimate conversation, in the sense he acknowledged that at one point in time this may have existed. He does not subscribe to it now. So he gets associated with death and is also, if you look at his vehicle, he also is, he has buffalo as his vehicle, much lower in the hierarchy. In Ramayana, Yama is described as a king, the son of Surya. However, the darker associations begin to surface. At one point in time, he is said to have been defeated by Ravan, and elsewhere he's even referred to as Ravan's brother, likely because both of them share the theme of destruction in their roles. Over time, Yama came to be a feared god. Yes, he was a feared god. Yamaraj aa jayenge. Iska matlab we understand. We are talking about death. He's not a god you speak of very fondly like Bal Gopal. So he's a feared god, although occasionally he is portrayed engaging in reflective dialogues on truth and consciousness, and that's important. If you were to read Katha Upanishad, the dialogue between Nachiketa and Yam, is very significant because he's talking about enlightenment of certain sort and a journey within in terms of higher consciousness. So he does get associated with truth, and he would be associated with truth in many myths in the Mahabharata and later on also. What happens to Yami? Now, Yami, in contrast to her twin, is scarcely remembered in a positive light. Remember, she's the one who's actually the one who's the instigator. She wants to attract and establish a relationship with the brother. In the mythographic imagination of later periods, she appears increasingly as the upholder of anarita. That is, anarita is untruth. So generally, it's Rita and Anarita. So she's considered to be the upholder of Anarita and is obviously marginalized. In the Brahmanas, that is not the Samhitas, the next thing, the Brahmanas, her character becomes more intricate. She evolves into a malevolent goddess Niritti. Same, she's often referred to as Niritti while still retaining traces of her original identity as the twin of Yama. In the Purush Ved ritual, which is described in Shatapatha Brahmana, if I'm not wrong in detail, then this duality is encoded symbolically. Just as a barren woman is to be offered to Yama, a woman bearing twins is offered to Yami. In the Taittiriya Brahmana, uh, the same imagery surfaces. We are told dark are her garments, dark the shaft which would be a sacrificial fee. It's a clear or vivid portrayal of Nirithi's appearance, not very pleasant, not something that evokes a sense of identification. Sukumari Bhattacharya, in her work Indian Theogony, argues that Yama's persona definitely became more complex with time. He absorbed violent, masculine aspects of death and justice, the two aspects that he'll be associated with. Yami, as his counterpart, took on the attributes of a chthonic malign goddess and becomes associated with Niritti, the dark mother, embodying dissolution and decay. In Puranas, and she does come in Puranas, Agni Puran, Vaman Puran, and others, Yami is transformed into the river Yamuna or Kalindi. The dark flowing sister of Yama in his aspect as Kala or time or death. This identification retains her association with darkness, while her earlier attributes are largely forgotten. Thus, the darker dimensions of the goddess endured even as her other traits are eclipsed. She is there. She's definitely there, even in the later literature, but as the darker goddess. And the darkness somewhere is associated with her, with I would say this is because of the fact that she's associated with pushing in a relationship with the brother. I think that could be the reason. Though with the passage of time, Yamuna would also be a purifying goddess. She would become a purifying goddess, but the color of Yamuna is always dark. Compare it to Ganga, and it is always dark. And if someone was to ask me, does this myth of Yama and Yami continue till this date? Somebody asked me in one of my interactions in another presentation, and it took me a while to recall. What I thought was Yamaraj is somebody we all are very scared of because he spells death. Yummy, we hardly ever remember, but I recall how the two have come in one of the advertisements. I think it's the advertisement of a Cadbury chocolate, if I'm not mistaken. where Yamraj on his buffalo, he comes to take away somebody because he comes and says, "Tumhara samay aa gaya hai, ab main tumhe le jaunga." So a little boy or a young man, he says, "Now you come along with me. It's your time." And the man does not want to go in. Instead, he offers him a Cadbury chocolate. And he takes a bite of the Cadbury chocolate and says, "Aha, yummy." Lets him go. So very interestingly, that association of Yama and Yummy have been brought to fore within an advertisement, but most of us should be familiar with the myth to be able to enjoy that conversation and what it says basically that if there is Yummy with Yama, death can be deferred for a while. Okay. Now, friends, I come to yet another myth that I'm taking into account this time from the Mahabharata. This is a myth that is associated with Pandu and Kunti. This comes in the Adi Parv, the first of the books of the Mahabharata. And the Adi Parv informs us of Pandu, who's the second son of Satyavati and Vichitravir, who was crowned as the king but was unable to reproduce due to the curse of a deer that he shot while it was mating. That's what we are told. But Pandu, if you go across, you read Charak Sahita. Uh, if you read Charak Sahita, you would find, I came across this word called Pandu Rog. Right? Pandu is there even in Charak Sahita, and it was a reference to anemia. So Pandu is a person who is anyway pale and who's unable to, or probably impotent also. But in this myth, story or narrative, we are told why he is so pale and impotent, probably because he tried to kill dear. Now, Pandu at that point in time blames the legitimate father for his addiction to hunting and gambling, something that would have taken him as a legitimate province of Kshatriya, because Vichitravir also seemingly died because of over engrossment in such kind of relationships and in drinking and gambling and so on. Now, he realized that he can't stay in the kingdom, so he leaves the kingdom, he renounces in a sense, and he enters the forest along with two of his wives, and then he practices austerities. Now, the clear intent now for him is uh, to practice austerities, to develop levels of higher consciousness and secure himself a seat in heaven. That is when he encounters one fine day a sage who tells him that you're a Kshatriya and you can never get a seat in heaven till you have a son. A lineage is an absolute must. And he gets so jittered at that point that he comes back. He realizes that he can't have an Horus. Horus is a biological son. He was, obviously, he knew that he was impotent, or because of the curse, he will not have it. But the possibility was still open to him that he can have a son through the practice of Niyog. Now, Niyog is the practice by which uh, if there is the husband is impotent, has died early, the marital family can appoint a niyogin, another man with whom the wife will mate, and if the son is born out of the union, he would be the successor to the husband of this woman. He would not be recognized by the biological father, but by the legal father. So this was a practice, Niyog was a practice which was there for a very long time. And in fact, my work on Niyog is about talking about the genesis of the practice and then its curtailment also. But he says that you have to, for that, he had to tell his wife that you must have a relationship with another man and you must give me a son, because I have been told that as a Kshatriya, I can never secure my position in heaven if I don't have a son. So he gives the example of a Kshatriya woman, Shardandayani, and who was commanded by a husband to beget the son, and uh, tells Kunti, and I'm quoting here, rather paraphrasing what he said. Listen, Kunti, to the story of Shardandayani, the hero's wife, whom her elders instructed to bear a child. She went to the forest with a pure and holy mind, having bathed on the fourth day at a night, that is after her periods. And at night, she goes to a crossroad. She picks out a Brahmin who had come to perfection, Vijam Siddham. After she made a sacrifice to fire god, they mated, and then she was blessed with a son. So he tells the whole story to Kunti. So, what was Kunti's reaction after she heard the story? She balked at the idea of establishing sexual relationship with anyone other than a husband and says that you must not speak to me like this. You know the dharma. I'm your wife. So she's talking about the Pativrata dharma, and I'm devoted to you. You are a strong, armed Bharat hero. You will definitely father me heroic sons according to dharma, and I'll go to heaven with you. You must come to me for children. For even in my thoughts, I cannot go to any man other than you. Now she cited, so he had cited a story, so she also cited a counter story to tell it. She cited the story of a queen Bhadra Kakshivati, and she said that husband had died, and she lay next to the corpse and she prayed to the gods. Then magically the spirit entered the body again. He made love to her, and then she became pregnant, and everything was hunky dory after that. And she could go back, and she had son with her, and because of which they could carry on with the lineage. Then she says, "O king, best of Bharats, you would definitely be able to bless me with sons with your lasting yogic power." So she's saying, use your austerities and yogic power in order to get that kind of, a magical quality by which you can father our children. However, the intimate conversation may have continued, but Pandu was not convinced by this argument and continued to cite cases that demonstrated the righteousness of the practice of Niyog in ensuring succession of lineages. He could sense her diffidence. She was not interested in having a relationship with another man, so he comes up with yet another story. Now, this is a story of Shvetaketu and Udala, and this is a very interesting story because Udalak had gone, to study in this brahmacharya phase. Then he comes back, and he's sitting with the father outside the hut, and there he sees that a Brahmin enters the hut and forces the mother out of the hut, and he takes her to the forest. So Shvetaketu seemingly is very angry at this and looks at the father, and the father seems cool and he says, "It's all right, son. Uh, this is an eternal dharma. Women are like this. They are uncloistered. They can go with any man that they choose to." And in the fit of anger, then Shvetaketu comes up with what we are called the Maryada law. The word Maryada, we are all familiar with, Apni Maryada mein raho. Remember, the genesis of this law came up with Shvetaketu. And he has some points that he gives in the Maryada law. And what is it? Very interesting. He says from this day on, women who commit adultery against their husbands are guilty of a crime which is the same as the act of abortion. It's a sin, both crime and sin, which will produce unhappiness. Point one. Secondly, this is more towards the men. He says, seducing a chaste virgin bride who's promised to a husband is also a crime. The third point he says, and this is very significant, that a wife who is ordered to bear a child and will not do so will also become guilty of the sin. So the Maryada law then is something that pushes, now at this point, he recalls that Maryada law, Pandu, and says, by that law, you will have to follow what I'm saying. I mean, he gives a proposition something, she desists, then he comes up with one argument after another argument, says, you will have to follow this. The law is already there. Maryada law is already there. He further cited the example of King Kalmashpat and his queen Madhyanti, because Kalmashpat could not have children of his own. He asked his teacher Vishish to cohabit with Madhyanti, and Madhyanti did have a son, Asma, who's known as a successor of Kalmashpat. So he's telling one story after another, and he's seeing what is the reaction of Kunti. Kunti is hearing him intently and probably not agreeing to it. And finally, he does this. He raises his folded hand on his head and pleads, Kunti, I beseech you, first is to beseech you, at my injunction, have a virtuous son by a Brahmin. And we are told then by the mythographers that Kunti finally gave into these words, which were a mixture of both plea and command. And from our perspective, this is important because this is a non-verbal gesture. He's angry at the same time, he's pleading, you'll have to agree to what I'm saying. And Kunti agrees. Okay, I will follow this. I would follow this. But from our perspective, there's a question that comes to our mind. When we look at what Kunti has been saying, can we think in terms of the emotion of love surfacing? Can we call her resistance or her diffidence something that is love? She does not want to have relationship with another man, and so she keeps on pleading, please do not push me there. Can we take it as an, and as an example of love? When I put this question across, counter question comes to my mind. Was this example of love, were girls at that time, at that point in time, actually allowed to have an autonomy of expressing their love, having their love? Were they not socialized right from their early stage to express love only for one person, and that's the husband, where duty and love could be interchanged? Because if you look at this longish argument and longish conversation, it is clearly and clearly against clearly about not about loving the husband a lot. That's a question that uh, comes to my mind. But at the same time, I mean, what I would say that there doesn't seem to be any distinction between the notion of pativrata and love. But all the same, in this dialogue itself, this longish dialogue itself, Kunti agrees to having children outside this marriage, but she retains her autonomy by saying that I will choose my, uh, the man that I want to have children, the surrogates. I'll choose the surrogates. And how will you choose the surrogate? She says, I have got a mantra from Durvasa Muni, and I can beckon any god to come here and I can have children through that. And we know that she had already practiced it once, and that's how she had beckoned Surya, and Karn was born. To this kind of an argument, which of course she doesn't share with, that she's already had a son early, that she doesn't share with Pandu, but she says, I've got this month. Pandu happily agrees. He also practices austerities along with her, and we know that uh, the first three sons are born out of a relationship with Yama on one side, Dharmaraj, that is with Indra and with Vayu, and then she shares this formula or mantra with Madri also, and the twins are born. We know that. So a certain iota of autonomy is still shown here. We're still talking of tribal societies where the voices of women could be heard, but this is a classic example of a society in transition. We can easily sense that egalitarian society, tribal setup where women had voices, was now transiting into an androcentric, patrilineal, patriarchal setup where the voice of the man is what calls for the shots. The woman is still able to. Okay, there's some. I'll take these notes a little later. Anyway, okay. So what we get to know is that there is an iota of autonomy, a little iota of autonomy, but we can see the elements of patriarchy and patrilineal coming up. Now, there is an added dimension to our query, uh, and this relates to the issue of, friends, this relates to the issue of renunciation. When I was reading this, I realized that renunciation as a phenomenon can be revisited. Why so? Uh, uh, what exactly is the definition of renunciation and penance? Is that what I think about? But look, Pandu had left his empire, whatever state or city, whatever kingdom, and had come to the forest precisely because he could not produce an heir. he could not produce an heir, and so he uh, uh, came so he came to the forest, and there he realized he needed to have an heir, and he was able finally to convince Kunti to produce the Kshetraj. Kshetraj is the son born through the practice of Neo, and he has actually has 5 sons as a result of that. Uh, Now the question that comes to my mind is, if he finally had sons, could he go back? Could he renounce his renunciation? जो वानप्रस्थ और संन्यास लिया, क्या वो वापस जा सकते थे? So this would have created a lot of complexity. But the story is that is renunciation something that can be you know that can be abandoned at any point in time. I think even the myth makers would have encountered this kind of complexity, and so they decided to remove Pandu from the plot altogether. And then Kunti with the 5 sons could go back, and they had not pledged anything, so they could rightfully then ask for their share in the Kuru territory. But this is a question about renunciation: is can renunciation be temporary? Can renunciation be given upon? Because the plot of the story was moving in that direction. It was just retrieved on time so that a new sub story could be added to it. Okay, there is yet another conversation between Pandu and Madri, which happens in the Adiparv verse 116. Pandu, by this time, is a proud father of 5 sons. When one day a sense of desire completely overtakes him, because he sees Madri in a very sensuous attire, and they both are alone in some corner of the forest. And then he makes it very clear in the conversation that he expresses desire to make love to her. She desists. And she reminds him of the curse and says, "You should not establish a relationship with me." But Pandu throws caution to winds, yearns for what he calls love, and then apparently forcefully cohabits with her, which ultimately leads to his death. Now, this is a very brief and a very conclusive conversation. It is not overtly complex as it is in the case of Kunti and Pandu. Still, it reminds the readers of destiny's settlement, which brings a significant change in the story's plot also. Both these two characters had to be removed. Pandu had to be removed so that now Kunti could return to the city along with her 5 sons to stake a claim on the share of the Kuru land. So what we see is that by and large, the intimate conversation between husband and wife definitely needs to be analyzed in the context of social and philosophical issues. What is clear to the student of history is that the myth reflected a society in transition. Again, from the pastoral nomadism, we are moving into a settled patriarchal setup where the ideas of Varna, kingship, and gender were constructed in favor of the new ruling class comprising the Brahmins and Kshatriya men. Okay, I have to move to the third part. I hope you people are not getting bored. I'll try and wind it up this very fast. And whatever questions you're writing, friends, I'll take a look at it once I finish my presentation. The last one deals with Shiva and Parvati. This is also an intimate conversation which comes in the Skanda Puran, which is a longish time period, from the 8th to the 14th century, we say. This is around the game of dice that is played by Shiva and Parvati in the Maheshwar Khand, the first of the Khands that we have, Khands. And it's an intimate conversation, but with a difference. Now, how is it different from the other conversation? This is a conversation between husband and wife, but there are many onlookers also participate in it. So I must acknowledge, principally it is between Shiv and Parvati. Now, as the story goes, Shiv and Parvati are making love, and they make love for a very long time. And that's when the gods become very worried, and they feel that if this love making materializes in the creation or reproduction of a son, then it's going to be very difficult for them, because both the deities are very powerful and the son is going to be more powerful than them. So it's much better that they put some kind of a hurdle and the child is not born. And we know about that. Shiva and Parvati do not have biological children, or ones common to both of them. That is the story. So this is that part when they're making love, they make love, and Nara disrupts and tells them, why don't you people play the game of dice? Which is again very strange. I mean, how does he enter? But that's how the story goes in the myth. Both Shiv and Parvati were equally skilled at the game of dice, and the idea that they are going to play, they both become very enthusiastic about it, and they are willing to start the game. In the first round, despite Parvati's attempting to cheat, she excelled in the game and she was very good at cheating also. In the first round, Shiva emerged victorious, drawing applause from Narad and others, especially Bringi, who was a devoted follower of Shiva. Parvati was very furious. But, and in the long conversation that happens, which I'm not picking up here, she does put Bringi in the place who had openly displayed his devotion to the master. Shiva and expressed unwavering confidence in his triumph, no matter how many times the game is played. But in the second round, they decide to have a wager. They bet something and they pledge their ornaments or whatever they possessed as the wager. Parvati won this round and she insisted that Shiva removes all that adorned his body. Bringi was nonplussed. Others also wondered what is she saying, but Shiva was amused, at least initially. The text narrators tell us the wonderful Gauri laughed and said to Shankar, O Shankar, give me the wager that you have lost. Then Mahesh laughingly spoke these words of truth. You have not really defeated me, O slender bodied one. Let it be pondered over. I am invincible unto all living beings in every respect. Hence, O chaste lady, these words should never be spoken. Gamble as much as you please, but it is I who would win eventually. But she insisted. She said, I have defeated you now, O Lord, the most auspicious amongst all auspicious things. O enemy of Smara, give me what has been lost by you and what you had promised me earlier. Shiva kept saying that he was invincible and he does not believe in what she is saying. And hearing these words that were repeated so often, she laughed and said, O Lord Mahadev, you are indeed invincible to everyone, but I alone have defeated you in the game of dice. You don't know anything regarding what needs to be done and what not to be done. So she's told him that, look, you don't understand. If you have lost, then you have to follow the rules of the game. And because you are not able to do it, I'm going to take off your possessions. Then Parvati proceeded to remove whatever he had possessed, the half moon, the snakes, and finally the loincloth with the force, much to the horror and shame of all onlookers. She appeared extremely brutal in asserting her superiority to her husband, almost like the gambler who had actually won the game. When Shiva looked embarrassed about the loincloth going, she says, I think it's tongue in cheek, she says, what do you have to do with the loincloth? You are a sage of sanctified soul. Some time back, you wandered through Daruvan without any clothes. Under the pretext of begging for alms, the sage's wife were enchanted. While you were going, they greatly adorned you. Your loincloth fell by chance, and the sages uttered nothing. Hence, what you have lost in the gambling game, you must abandon now. So it's very interesting. Possibly she was hurt by that earlier incident, and she reminds him about that once you lost your loincloth, you still carried on with your begging. It did not matter. Women also were amused and men did not utter a word. So how does it matter if you lose it now? But Shiva became very angry with her and stared at her with the third eye. All men gathered there shrunk in fear, but Parvati retorted, Oh, what avail is your stare with your greatest eye? I am not Kala, not Kama, not the sacrifice of Daksha. I am not Tripura, O Shambhu, not Andak, O bull emblemed Lord. What will come out of your staring thus? In vain you have become Virupaksh. Virupaksh is you've opened up your eye before me. So in a sense, she reprimanded him. What are you doing? You have lost the game. You can't bring about destruction because you have lost the game. And it seemed very clearly that Parvati had no regrets about doing what she did unto Shiva. And Shiva is so angry at this moment that in a huff, he leaves her, goes to the forest, and chooses that particular moment to now invoke Atman. So there are some scholars who inform us that this was deliberately done by Parvati. She intended to observe the causes of his emerging into activity, and the emergence did happen. So for some time, he was not really paying enough attention to the duty. This was, as some scholars say, this was one way of invoking. That would be one explanation. But if we take the story further, we find that Parvati initially enjoyed her victory, but after a while, she started missing it. And this was noticed by Vijaya, a companion, and she could see that she was extremely sad. And then she turned to Parvati and she says, "What have you done? Have you forgotten the fact that you had gone into penance and austerities for thousands of years to win over Shiva? And now you push him to the forest. What have you done?" She said, "And haven't you heard that gambling is fraught with flaws? It was your mistake that Shiva went there. Now go and get it back." So Parvati thinks for a moment and she says, "Yeah, yeah, it's time to forgive Shiva." And she now agrees to search for him. She dawns on the role or an image of a Shabri woman, very captivating, with a captivating figure to ensnare Shiva. And she looks around where he's in the forest, spots him, and goes close to him. And Shiva is distracted at that particular moment. And he says that he looks at her, gets a little impressed by her, and in fact, he becomes desirous of her. And she says, "In case you want me, you'll have to talk to my father." And takes him. All this is a pretense, and then she takes him to the father. And as the dialogue between the father and Shiva happens, she bursts out laughing. And in a moment, Shiva gets to know that he has been duped the second time now. He's a little upset, and that's the time for out of nowhere Narad appears, and we know Narad can appear anywhere, anytime. And he comments that association with women always makes men look foolish. And so, in a sense, the blame is transferred on Parvati. Shiva is angry for some time, but then she succeeds in persuading him, and he returns to their home. Now, this conversation provides a thought provoking analysis, and its complexity offers much to unpack. So let me try and understand it, do a conversation analysis of it. Now, the depiction of Parvati's engagement with the game of dice actually challenges the gender roles. Generally, I've also worked on gambling as a game, a sport in ancient India. I could not really come across women participating in it. It's generally a game that is fought amongst, or it is played amongst men. And here we have Parvati, who actually not just participates, she's a very skilled player. She is even skilled at cheating wherever and wherever she could. So that's one thing we find if we look from a gendered perspective, that's challenging the role that has been assigned to women. Also, Parvati's reaction to Shiva's supporter insult reveals, incredible inner strength. She doesn't succumb to the humiliation, especially coming from Bringi. And she confronts the provocations with poise, indicating a capacity to handle adversity with grace and intelligence. She does that. Also, she has a very unyielding determination. Once she realized that she has failed in it, she has that kind of determination to fight it out. Again, something that is generally the reserve or preserve of men. But here we find Parvati doing that, and doing that with an elan. But most important, I find this conversation very interesting because it enabled repair mechanism to function. What we had talked about in conversation analysis. If you look at this longish, conversation, it is in verse 34 and 35. What we find is that she is able to set things right in her household. Now, Parvati's challenge to Shiva might be interpreted as disruption of traditional roles and expectations, suggesting a critique of the hierarchical systems of relationships, even within the divine families. This is actually the disruption of a divine household. Now, from a historical and a social perspective, the myth represents an intricate and layered narrative in which power dynamics, gender expectations, and social roles are constantly being negotiated. Well, this is one myth where clearly Parvati's autonomy is endorsed time and again. She is very autonomous, she's very resourceful. What we found is that the story concludes with the assertion of male dominance. This is a reflection of the prevailing cultural attitudes of the time. Shiva is shown to be a victim of her deception. And the mythographers seem to be intent on reminding Parvati, and by that logic, women of their time, of their supposed space in the family politics. Even if they have won the game, Parvati had won the game, but Parvati was finally made to, one could say, is to comply to that kind of familial politics and bring the husband back and repair the relationship that had been um, wounded. Now, I would also now like to take a look at the historical implications of it, which is very, very important. Sorry, before I come to that, there's another point from a gender perspective that I want to raise. Um the role of Narad in this. Narad here actually is somebody who's shown to be a character. He's actually the character created by the mythographers to uh, to bring the story in line with the larger patriarchal milieu. There were 2 points where, as a woman, I would like to question Narad. At the first point, why did Narad not tell Shiva, and he could talk to Shiva at any point in time, that why did you put that as a wager, or that you possess? You were overconfident. Now that you have lost it, you should abandon whatever you had put as a wager. He does not say that. He's quiet. And second time, when she dupes him the second time, that's when he says association with women leads to this as women. Once again, what we find is siding with Shiva time and again, saying that whatever comes to you is because of the women, or the woman factor, because when she cheats, when she dupes, this is what happens to men. That aspect was something which gives away a very patriarchal slant of the mythographers of the day, though we can find that the stories associated with Parvati does reflect her as a very powerful figure. So how do we explain this historically? That is important. A student of history has to go back to history time and again. Now, I did mention it to you earlier that the Skanda Puran has a fairly expansive time frame, 8th century to 14th century, also pan-Indian spatial spread. Now, this is also the time that is associated with the rise of three different cultic traditions. Shakta tradition is there. Along with that is Shaiva and the Vaishnav tradition. So there are multiple, there are followers who are around, and many Purans are being actually written at this time. And we know the 18 Purans can actually be divided into at least 12 of them are there for Shiv and Vishnu, and there are many Up-Purans which are dedicated to Shakti. Now, in this kind of a setup, what may come as a historical explanation, I'm just trying to hazard a guess. This is a time when these cultic traditions are coming up, and in some of the traditions, we can find that, especially in the Shak tradition, what we find is that the female characters are very strong. So there is a possibility that as as the political expansion was happening, political expansion of those rulers who were the followers of Brahminical traditions, the followers of Vaishnavism or Shaivism, especially Shaivism, as their impact was spreading, cultic assimilation happened in the marginalized area. So the myths that we are talking about within the Skanda Puran may actually reflect the process of these cultic tensions and amalgamations in the Brahminization of many tribal societies, many of which may have been, socially far more egalitarian. So the followers of the Parvati tradition may have been very strong, and they had very strong mythic tradition around Parvati. So happened in the case of Shiva tradition also. And as the Brahmanization is happening, the two of them come together in a familial format, but eventually in the Purans, the Shiv Purans, what we find is in the Shiv Purans, what we find is that that Parvati is falsified, and she's shown her place within the larger familiar setup. But in the Shakti tradition, Parvati as Shivadyuti and other characters, use so many formats that she's shown to be extremely powerful. So this may be a reference because Skanda Puran then is a reference to a Puranic tradition where the Brahmanization process gets reflected. So some kind of tension is there, and finally a resolution in the favor of those who were really the followers of Shav tradition. And so we have a very patriarchal notion that gets ratified. So, friends, in conclusion, what we can infer is that myths provide us with clues to social and historical developments that may not be always be empirically correct. And that's what I said. Myths may not be empirically correct, but they still point towards possibilities in emerging or changing social formations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. As a student of history, this was a dream come true to be able to be confronted with, because these are the questions that one also grapples with when one is reading ancient history, of understanding. And in fact, if we have time, I'd like to ask a few questions of my own, because we never left with time. But if I could ask, when we say Victorian modesty, we're wrong in putting it on the 18th century, right? When we say, oh, Victorian modesty crept in, and that is how India's view of women or chastity or conservative nature change. It had
Comes in
started,
the 18th, 19th century.
yes, but it
That is
started way before, right? We've seen a transition period within the midst itself.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. You see, Victorian modesty, not everything can be put down to a colonial interaction because you have very clear references to transitions taking place. Yummy Yummy myth, or for that matter, even the epic myths that I was talking about, really refer to this. They definitely refer to a transition when the society is becoming more and more patriarchal, and that patriarchy may be once again reiterated in the Victorian time. The only thing about Victorian time is that what we call Victorian morality is something that comes from yet another perspective. That is the British perspective or the Western perspective. So they start looking at these kind of practices in another way altogether. Well, when they come out, even in South India, they come across, you probably are aware of the fact there's some Bandham tradition that is there in Kerala. The priests are horrified. ये क्या हो रहा है? How can they have this kind of sambandha? And so uh, this may have been a practice there in the matrilineal traditions in South India, but then that is not accepted by them. And the whole notion of Victorian morality comes in very strongly there. But if you're talking about censures and if you're talking about moralities of different kinds, entire Indian history is full of that. You can pick it up at any other point, but as students of history, what we need to do is to look at a larger social formation, when and how and when time it emerged, and then start rationalizing it.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We can come back to my questions once we have dealt with the questions from the participants. So we have a couple of questions from Priyank and Yash. Others, please use the raise hand feature to directly ask your questions or put them in the chat box. So Priyank writes a comment for your observation. This clearly establishes that sexuality is not a psychologically repressed phenomenon, as is said by Sigmund Freud, but socially produced and constructed phenomenon, as said by Foucault.
Socially constructed, definitely. It would have dimensions. I do not agree with you in totality because it has psychological dimensions also. It would have that. There would be some aspects that have an impact. There may be a repression that comes out in some or other way that may be there, but yes, social aspects of the social repression is equally an important aspect to be gauged. I would personally say it's a mix of two. As I told you, if you go by what I explained in Yama and Yummy, you have views of sociologists, anthropologists, and psychologists all talking about the same subject, but from a slightly different vantage, and all concurring in it. Most of the time, McLennan's view or Malinowski's view, or for that matter, Levi Strauss's view, all match with those of Freud. They acknowledge the fact that there may be, the whole idea about uh, in the growing up years, a girl and a boy, or in the enter adolescence, the idea of attraction may be very, very strong. So there is a psychological dimension, definitely a psychological dimension. Along with that, because along with that, the sociological dimension is equally important. I would say it's a mix of the two. It can't, psychology cannot be completely
Uh,
marginalized.
can I say, like, what I meant was the distinction between the repression and the production. So, is the desire and the sexuality in the society repressed and then came out, or it's been produced constantly by discourses like myths and stories? Um, yeah,
Repression,
so
repression is the psychological repression that you're talking about, I feel gets embedded in the stories. I do not agree that it can be only a sociological phenomenon. That idea about desires, if you look at the myths themselves, most of the time the myths talk about the fact that the desire of women may be strong. If it is not channelized well, it may lead to something else. So you see, in the Rik Samhita, it's clearly said man and woman come together only to reproduce. Agar se, even if only this aspect is taken into account, it only answers half the story. The other thing is, um, definitely a pressure to repress your desire. There is a pressure to repress your desire. A woman is told, what is, after all, tell me, what are these devices or concepts like virginity, importance of virginity and chastity are all about? Virginity, chastity, of course, from a patriarchal point of view, so the sociology comes in, the social aspect comes in, but the whole idea is you learn to repress and suppress them for the good of the society, but that it can lead at any point in time to a psychological expression of it. Let me give you one example. You must have heard the story of Shrupanakha. If you have heard the story of Shrupanakha, she's always saying, when she goes and she, at a time when Sita, she's there and she's clearly expressed a desire for love. Now, the desire of love, she's at least been able to articulate it, so she's not repressing it. She's trying to bring that out, but because she is talking about that desire of love, she's given a very negative, portrayed negative light to it. So the desire of love, is it repressed or not? I agree, it is repressed and it can come out in very different forms also at any point in time. It can come that there is an aspect of psychology associated with it.
Thank you, Priyank. Arti I see that your hands raised, so you and then
Yeah.
you can follow.
Thank you so much, ma'am. This was fascinating. I think every word was just riveting. I especially enjoyed the Yama Yummy story. And as you described it as reflecting the emergence of exogamy, I was curious, are there myths that also then reflect the emergence of caste endogamy over time? May not be back to the Vedic times, but
Ah,
yeah, over
yeah,
time.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
what are some of those examples?
Oh, the entire practice of Varna Sankar. See, you have
Varna?
Varna Sankar that will come up. Varna Sankar is miscegenation of castes. So you see,
Yeah,
what the whole argument is that it has to be exogamy when it relates to your immediate family, Gotra,
yeah,
as it
yeah.
will be called with the passage of time, immediate family. But it is endogamy when it comes to larger, caste formatting.
Mm,
Now, if you're talking about whether there are myths that relate to going against the practice, yes, we have so many of them. Varna Sankar is a practice by which, uh, is a practice which is actually negated in the Brahminical literature, but it also tells that this practice happened where people were cohabiting against their caste
mm,
diktats. So you would have, you've heard of Chandalas, you've heard
Mm.
of Nishadas. Chandala is supposed to be the descendant of a mother who's a Brahmin and a father, yeah, and a father who is a Shudra. Nishada is supposed to be the descendant of a family of a mother who is uh, Shudra and the father who is. So it's the Anulom and Vilom marriages that we talk about. So there are many myths which are put, and these myths are often narrated. This is Varna Sankar myth of the king Veena. मतलब पूरी बहुत लंबी वेन myth है पूरी, which is actually narrated time and again to remind people. If you know the when we talk about the marginalized communities in our country, of the backward and the Dalits, if I may call them, they have been told about this myth time and again through the passage of time till that you have got your position because your ancestors indulged in Varna Sankar.
Mm.
So that has been there. So the practice should be exogamy when it comes to Gotra, endogamy when it comes to your Varna. And if you
Yeah, I'll
dare
look those up.
flout it,
Yeah.
they are
Mm.
then you are supposed to be punished for it. I hope I've answered your question.
You've given me more questions, which I will go and research.
Okay, okay,
But please
okay,
come
okay.
back, ma'am, for more.
Oh, please, no problem. Manu Smriti has details on this, Varna Sankar. Which chapter? Chapter 9. I think chapter 9 has it. Details about how, Veda. I can look for it. I can't recall exactly, but the Vena's, King Vena's story is there, which actually gives us the idea. Like, there's certain myths that we take. Creation of caste, which myth we go to Purush Sukta in the Rigved 10th Mandal. Creation of Varna Sankar, we go to Dharma Sutras also, but it gets concretized in Manusmriti. Dharma
Thank you
Sutras
so
will be
much.
slightly
Mm.
before that.
Yash, I had seen that you raised your hand, so please go ahead with the question.
Miss Jung's collective unconscious, the way he theorized it, the way he propounded it, is it supposed to be a universal formula? Uh,
Well,
uh,
he
uh,
says,
yes, is it supposed to be a universal thing, or can it be more particularistic also? Like certain collective unconscious myths are particular to certain civilizations. I ask
yes.
this questions. I ask this question because if it is the latter, then it has a lot of potential to get misappropriated and misused by, let us say, fascistic elements, as has happened in past, like Julius Evola
You,
and Arthur Campbell.
you know, he goes against, he was a student of, if I'm not mistaken, Sigmund Freud. And on this
Yes,
particular
he was his
issue of
colleague.
collective,
Yes,
huh? Was
he was
he?
his
He
colleague, I
was.
suppose.
And it was on this issue of collective unconscious, if I'm not mistaken, that differences did emerge. One of the issues that did emerge. You know, his theory of collective unconscious also needs to be accepted with a pinch of salt. I'll not deny that. See, in certain aspects of our collective unconsciousness, he's talking about the collective. He's talking about a group of people. He's really talking about the group of people. And it makes sense if you're looking at what we may say early evolutionary societies of humanity. It makes sense there. But and when I tried to understand, I sat down with, I'm talking of how many 25 years back, I sat down with my in the department of psychology with a senior teacher to try and understand what do we mean by collective unconscious. धीरे 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 करते हुए, she brought me to the issue of sanskar. What you understand as sanskar, something that you're uh, absorbing in a very intangible way. You keep absorbing that, and then you start reflecting your views on that. So, but it is a group identity. Clearly, Jung's idea was related to group identity and nothing else. But individually, if you look at it, you're right. As you say,
Yes,
if you
ma'am,
put,
because yes, I asked this because it is happening in present also. Like a lot of Jung's philosophy has been misappropriated by bad faith actors. Like I don't want to call it that, but a lot of Jordan Peterson, what he says, it is amenable to that fascistic rhetoric. And I think he follows Jung very closely. He calls himself as a student.
okay, I didn't know about this. I think I need to read more about this. But you know what I find is that today in the world of postmodernism, each experience is very unique by itself. So, yes, it can be misappropriated. It can be talked about, things that what I'm doing today is something that I've absorbed many years back, and this is my individual reaction to it. That is possible. That is possible. But frankly, friend, I'll have to read more on it to be able to contrast it to collective unconsciousness. But clearly, Jung is talking about the collective unconscious. Is not taking it individually. Like the phenomenologist actually pay attention to individual consciousness dimension. But they also, when they talk about the primeval myth, they say that the group comes together, becomes a part of it, but they experience it individually. In that sense, they experience it individually. But an interesting example, phenomenologist का viewpoint से ले, I don't know if you know, have you seen those things of jagratas that happen?
Yes, I
You
have.
know, the mata ki chauki lagti hai, jagratas aate hain, and invariably I went there only to see what it is like. We all know that one person is going to get possessed by the atma of the devi and will start answering questions of people. So again, I mean, nowadays I think this all is dramatized. A person who's going to get possessed will already know of it and will dance in the same way like a shaman and all that. But people coming together and performing that and singing aloud and somebody dancing is also a mark of your identity, and it gives you a it's almost all people coming together around the same line without the need of spelling out what they're doing. It's understood collectively. It is understood. That
It's
aspect
in
comes up.
a universal manner, right? Because if it is not universal and if it is more particularistic, then it makes itself more amenable to, you know,
Appropriation by some.
yes,
Yeah.
basically that.
Yes, it can. It can. But some of
Yes.
the universal things which he talks about, because I read that article a couple of years back, is really making use of these concepts of sacrifice. Why does a bull sacrifice have to happen? I picked it up from there. Why does this have to happen? All the societies seem to be reacting to a situation in almost similar lines. So that's when he says that you may be in eastern part of the hemisphere or the western part of the hemisphere, your reaction is so much common that it may be related to the concept of symbols and archetypes as a part of
So the
collective
formulation is universal, basically.
universal. Many people,
Yes.
so he's picking up some ideas which are generalized, that are accepted all across, yes, but
That,
individually utilizing it for something else may be dangerous. You may have a point, yeah.
yes, and yes, just last thing, because Jung himself was, initially he was very sympathetic to Nazis when they rose to power. He was kind of fascinated with them. Later, he of course distanced, when all of that happened. But yeah, but
Mm,
that answers it. Thank you, ma'am.
yes, yes,
Uh,
and all of us have a right to change our views also. With passage of time, we realize by endorsing something uh, we may be actually creating trouble for some.
Vidyaji, I know that, ma'am, we've gotten way past the time that we've taken from you. Can we have two more questions before we call it a day, or should we message those to you as you wish, ma'am? ले लें अभी?
Whatever you want to do.
आप
If
ले
there's
लो?
any,
There are two people who want to ask questions.
yeah.
I'll
Please
message
go
my
ahead.
questions. I'll email it to you.
Okay.
Vidyaji, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a very fascinating lecture. And like I think Aarti said, like we would really like to hear you again. Um, one question I had in mind is like, so when we are talking about the rituals and it happening all over India homogeneously, uh, in most areas, but why is it that this endogamy is more seen in southern part of India?
Okay, you're talking about the relationships that
Yes,
exist between men.
yes.
Why is it that it happens? I personally, I would say that Hinduism or Brahmanism is such a vast tradition with so many multiple strains built in within its system that it allows us to justify some practices at some point in time uh, at some places. See, one of the reasons behind this kind of endogamy, or even for that matter, if you were to even go back to the Egyptian civilization, I'm sorry, I'm bringing that example. The marriage between brother and sister, the incest is most common there, which is kind of
Right.
documented.
Right.
Idea there is to retain the blue-bloodedness, in the sense that if you are married within the family, with the
Yeah.
within the family, to the gotra is different. I mean, what
Mhm.
they say is that uh, within the family, in the sense that the gene mapping would be similar, but in their understanding, the gotra, which is decided by exogamy, is very much there. But if you know somebody of the family, you know who the father, the mother, and very close to you, you have perfect genes in your. The assumption is you have perfect genes in your children. So today we believe it's just the opposite. When we know that
But
the genes are their similarity, there's going to be more trouble
isn't
biologically.
the isn't the factor of economic or probably at that time or power wise also that's
This
yeah.
this could be one of the factors. Economic factors are also important because, say, the land can be retained within the old setup, and wherever you have, vestiges of very old tradition. Now, in South India, if you were to compare North and South India, friends, I find that the kind of hold they have on the Vedic tradition per se is superior to that in the North, or most of the Vedic and Brahminical literature, friends, we have been able to retrieve from the South in their
So
untainted form, because they have maintained that kind of, how do I say, use the word purity. They have
mhm.
actually maintained. They've been very strict in following their norms compared to many traditions in North India. It has reached South India a little later in the day, because these are traditions which are largely of the northwestern tradition and the Ganga belt. Bit by bit, they're coming down to south, and they're coming down to south with the Brahmins. Brahmins were called Bhattamars, and they were employed by the kings, and that is when their process of Brahminization, caste formation starts. But because these people were actually appointed by the kings, and they had to start writing things down, they became very strict with the rules, and that's how they would have their privileges. So if everything is within their closed circuit, they not only is the purity maintained, but as you put it across, their economic privileges also maintained. These get sustained with ease. That could be one of the reasons I feel that the marriages between cross cousins, marriages that we say, happen there in I think Tamil Nadu region, where the mothers where the niece and mom
Uncle and
married,
yeah.
yeah, though they also recognize that create a lot of biological problem for the children. That is a very modern understanding. Otherwise, purity. So एक
Yes.
होता theological explanation, एक होता real economic explanation. There could be so many things. But the logical explanation that they give is purity of life.
Yeah. So when you raise that regional influence, that's one interesting fact when we were narrating. It is about that contrast, like in like Ramses and Nefertiti and all that. They are like that blood relations. But when we are talking about Yama and Yemi, it is Rigveda. It's kind of we are talking about same period, right?
You're
Like
talking about, sorry, I didn't get
same
it.
period of time. Kind of like I mean 1500 BC or 2000 B,
Compared to what? I didn't get the first part, sorry.
Ramses second and Nefertiti. I mean that's the
Acha,
brother.
acha, Egyptian,
Yeah.
Egyptian times.
Yeah, it is a contrast where Yama and Yemi is about that
No,
relationship
no, Ramsey, and I mean the actual Egyptian old kingdom, if you take into account, is much older than that.
older. Okay, 3000. Yeah.
Much older.
Okay.
The Egyptian, when we say Egyptian, is probably one of the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia. The time that we are giving is 3,200 BCE.
3000.
While the
Okay.
New Kingdom is the one which will overlap with the Persian tradition. You have the Old Kingdom, Middle, and the New. If I'm not mistaken, I
Uh,
did teach this a
Ra-
couple of
Ra-
years back.
yeah, Ramses is like yeah
What
13
would it be?
200,
1500 New Kingdom आएगा ना? New
yeah
Kingdom आएगा वो. But the
79
tradition, huh?
1200 1200
Yeah, 1200 is
700.
that is the time where
Yeah.
yummy is there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um,
We are not very sure about. You see, there was a contact definitely between Egypt and Mesopotamia. That we are
mhm.
sure about. Directly contact between Egypt and Harappa is not verifiable at all. But and Persia would be the Elam place, Elam. So
Right.
it would be between Iraq, Mesopotamia, and India. Gradual diffusion of ideas, one can say, it may always be there. There's a gradual diffusion of ideas, but this particular idea about Persian idea about Yaman Yami is related within the Avestan tradition with the creation of humanity. Misha and Mishnah. It's the creation of humanity. It's called the origin myth. The two of
Right.
them cohabited to populate the world, to create the world. The same way as we have Brahma and Saraswati in the Vedic and the Puranic tradition. Brahma and Saraswati. That is a tradition where, because they are the first man and woman, let's put it this way, so they naturally had to cohabit with each other to procreate. That is one part. That's a creation hymn. But when it comes to Egypt, it's not the creation aspect. It is the, as I say, the purity, the blue-bloodedness that is important. That the continuity of lineage has to be on that line. So the best, the most intelligent and purest blood lies within the same family. They are the descendants of Ra Re, the sun god. तो वो उसकी उसकी इसकी theology and mythology is slightly different.
Right. Okay, thank you. I think you mentioned about double axe Minoan myth also, but
Or
then
should I talk about
maybe
it?
some other time, probably.
I can talk about it here in just 2 minutes. But before that, I should also tell you there is a difference between myths at one level and the historical facts. When we are talking about Egyptian rulers, this is what actually happened. Myths is an oblique reference to that, not a direct reference to it. So the brother-sister marriage in Egypt actually took place amongst the royalty. It actually took place. While in others, it is a reflection of that. That's one point I said. The myth of the double axe, which has a psychological implication. Now, this is something that happens in Crete. Crete is South Minoan civilization, South Greece, and it is in this particular area experiences a lot of earthquakes. Now, it was generally believed that earthquakes came when the bull was not propitiated, gods were not propitiated with the bull sacrifice, and the bull is then going to shake his head because everything is resting on his horns. That Crete is resting on the horns, he would shake the head and then earthquake would happen. So one of the ways in which the propitiation happened was through sacrifice. Now, sacrifice is where you're killing the killing the bull, but killing of any being can also leave a psychological scar. So the whole myth is about the killing, and everybody who's part of that killing process stands in a semicircle, and then they start saying who killed this bull, because who sacrificed the bull. एक तो sacrifice है, but a killing भी है. So who killed the bull? So the king would say, I did it on behalf of this man. That would say, I did it because so and so ordered me, so and so ordered me, so and so ordered. So they keep shifting the blame to the other person. And finally, they realize, they say, the bull has been killed not by an individual, but by this double axe. So the axe is used to actually kill it, the double axe. It's like this. This axe killed the bull, and so the entire blame is put on the axe and that is thrown in the sea. And this is a very interesting example of how you're passing your guilt. You're passing the blame to another person. This is what I meant when Jung said that, that the phenomenon is not just social, but also psychological, because it is almost a feeling of catharsis. I put the blame on somebody else and I can rest. Now I'm relaxed now. This is what it is about.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a final question from Jitu ma'am, and we have two comments for you with regards to your publication in the chat box. So we can take the question first and then the comments.
Okay.
I promise this will be the last question. I'll email my question because I have a lot of questions too, especially with regard to the practice of Niyog. But I'll email those to you on your LSR account, right?
Fine, no problem.
Thank you, ma'am. Jitu, please go ahead with your question.
Yes. Hi, ma'am. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was really interesting. I don't come from a history background, and then listening to this, it was a really interesting perspective. I was just wondering, what was the role of myths while they were being made in that particular time period that they were being played? So did everyone interact with them greatly? I'm asking from a sense of, say, in my current times, the two parts of the role back then and the role now, because in my current time, like even if I were to say with my age group people, I don't think I know, as I don't engage with as many epic stories or mythological stories. I don't know if that's got to do something with the advent of science, or we living in a more logical world. So one is, what role did they play then? And now, what role do you think? How are new myths being created in the current times, and
New
how is
myths
it
are
going
being
forward?
created all the time. All the time. I gave you that example in the advertisement of Yum and Yummy.
Yeah.
That's an example of creation of a new myth. And it is a
Okay.
recall of the myth also, and the example of the
Yeah.
myth also. But today also, just to give you one example, have you seen the new posters and hoardings where Ram and Hanuman are shown in a very aggressive mode? Have you seen that? If you look at the traditional roles and the role that it is, like in Ramcharitmanas, Hanuman is known as the Bhakta, and he would tear apart his heart to show how much he loved Krishna and Ram and Sita, and that they dwell in his heart. That's the image of a Bhakta, total supplicant that you have in today's scenario. I guess it is what to do about the geopolitics of today. When you think of gods, the gods are there, but the gods are there not only to take you under their safety umbrella, but they are also gods who are there to inspire you with a retaliation, which you don't associate. We never associated Ram with this kind of retaliation till you reach the part of Raman. Huh? And with Hanuman, it is always bhakti that comes up. But the scenarios are changing, and the way the stories are now being recalled and put across, there is a very different demeanor that comes up now. It's different. It's different. Now, coming to the first part of the question, that if I think what you said is, who are the creators of these stories? No other follows. So if you were to look at even the earliest times, I mean, early tribal societies or whatever we have been managed. See, the earliest stories that we have come across in the context of early Indian history are the Vedic stories. Wahin se hamara shuru hota hai. That's the first document that we have. What happened before that amongst the populace has also been lost. We don't know about it. Now, the Vedas were composed by a certain set of people. Okay, they are the Brahmins. In fact, Brahmins were also, if you look at the Rig Sahita, are one of the 17 kinds of priests. You have the Udgatra, Ardhavaryu, बहुत सारे हैं ब्राह्मण्स तो वो थे जो ब्राह्मणास पढ़ते और एक्सप्लेन करते थे at a time when sacrifices were happening. But you had so many kinds of priests, and out of which, how the tension, how this worked out, that ultimately the term Brahmin came to be applied to all kinds of breed, or they became the more superior ones. So these texts have actually been compiled by them. Or if you look at the Dharma Sutras, if you look at even the Ashtadhyayi, the grammar book, or if you look at Manu Smriti or Artha Shastra or Yagyabalkya Smriti, all these have a Brahminical stamp on it. What I mean by Brahminical is that they are the educated members of the society who also they were educated. They also passed on that trait and trade also to the subsequent generations. They did that, and obviously they saw the society from a certain kind of lens, and that is how they see it. So the prescription, say on incest, may have been a feeling running around within a small group कि अब तो ये नहीं होना चाहिए. It should be spelled out as sin. But the job of spelling it out as sin would then be given to Brahmins. They becomes the custodians of the society. And then the Brahmins are being employed as purohits in the kingdoms, in the king's court. They're also being given the responsibility of working out genealogies. So there's certain sections. Later on, the Kayas would also start doing that. So if you look at the long trajectory, there are some people who are finally doing this. Some of them are doing that. They become the, I don't know whether they're self-appointed custodians or they're given that kind of a charge. So there's a particular kind of viewpoint that gets reflected. But interestingly, in a text like Vedas that we are saying, the Rig Samhita for that matter, we are also able to see the views of the other, how the othering is happening. वो भी है. मृद विचर्स बोल रहा है किसी को जिनकी भाषा मधुर नहीं है, या those who live in Magad are called Magads and they are sidelined. So the views of others also come up here. Vratyastom. In fact, you manage to read that, and that is when we say the skill comes up by through your training. So, but if you were to ask, by and large, who are writing this, who are composing these are the educated sections of the society and the ritual freeze most of the time. In the initial part, later on, Kayas would join them.
No, along with who's writing, what's the influence? Like, who are the people not just
They
reading,
are
but
very influential. We consider them a part of the ruling class. Extremely influential. They're the ones who are performing the rituals. See, Vedic time, these were a little exclusionary. By the time we come to the Puranas, they are the ones who are performing so many rituals are being performed by them. They are in direct touch with the populace. They go and perform जितने शांति क्या कहते हैं उसको शांति यज्ञ करवा रहे हैं या बच्चे के पैदा होने पर रिचुअल हो रहा है. So they're in touch with the masses and they're telling them. आज भी तो होता है. वो क्या सत्यनारायण की कथा? Very interesting. I attended once. I don't go to these kathas, but I attended once precisely to understand what it is like. There is a pandit who is giving you the story about Sati and others, and they're women. Basically, clientele क्या है? Women बैठी सुन रही हैं. दो तीन तीन questions पूछ रही हैं, वो उनका जवाब दे रहे हैं. But in the process, the whole notion of pativrata is reinforced, re-endorsed. What happens when you have this? कौन सा वाला ritual होता है? वो करवा चौथ वाला, where women sit together. Usme the priest may not be there, but they're recalling the same stories time and again. So they're reinforcing the idea. So it is done by design. I mean, I would say it's done by design, definitely. And the influence is immense. You see, what will come up later in times is what M.N.S. Srinivasan talks about Sanskritization. These were initially meant for Brahmins were doing it for Brahmins to start with. ठीक है, अपने clientele gradually Brahmins or Kshatriyas maximum. Later on, what you will have is the aping of it. If it is happening in the Brahmin family, if it is happening in the, we would also start this. So all the traditions that were probably in all possibility, which were actually reflecting the viewpoint of Brahmins and Kshatriyas for themselves, then percolate down or filter down to the lowest levels. So the expansion is further. बहुत होता है उससे expansion. मतलब tremendous influence. Tremendous is the word.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, ma'am. I think my mom also just wants to say something.
Yeah, I should say it was a very enlightening lecture that we heard from you. I'm an architect. So, being an architect, I was trying to look at the way the old Vastu Shastra and other stuff, I've been working on that. So, what I realized was you have something called Vastu Purusha Mandala. So,
Right.
in which you have deities. So I was really wondering what are these deities. When I get deeper into it, then I had to dwell more into astrology, in which each deity, it has a
Yes.
whole lot of a connotation of each and everything.
Yes,
So it
yes.
is a very, very densely layered aspect of understanding the qualitative aspect, how it affects emotionally and mentally the various aspects about a human being, where even Ayurveda is also integrated as a part of the whole thing. So, and also I've been working much deeper into it, trying to understand what is the origin of all this, the way the concept have evolved, like the Triguna theory, which talks about how, you have the Brahma and then you have Vishnu. There's so many connotations. It's not one. There's so many layers in it. How does
Absolutely.
one
Yes.
understand, coming from a background where you have absolutely no knowledge about all these things? And if I have to really understand these, and I also understand the today's definition about the myth that you talked about, it is a very spiritual consciousness which is brought about as principles that are put in myth, which is a very beautiful definition which I resonate a lot with. So I really am so confused about how to go about if I have to go deeper and dwell deeper into these subjects.
It all depends on what is the stance that you are taking up. See, I have taken up the stance of a historian, so I'm trying to look at it in a very rational way. But somewhere I also understand that there is a connect that one can establish at a spiritual line. I'll not deny that. Now, you talked about Vastu Shastra and you talked about various, uh, deities. They're like guardian deities, even when you enter the temple, you have the Yali at times, which is basically looking after you, or prosperity, talks about prosperity. There are different kinds of deities with different meanings to it. Now, a Vastu Shastra, I personally felt, is very based on scientific lines. Your house towards your house should open towards the main gate towards the east, or this should be towards this. All that seems to be, to my opinion, very, very scientific. But what happens is that sometimes science cannot be explained as science to the populace of that time. So it did get ritualized, it did become a part of a religious tradition, but because the kind of importance religion got, I doubt science could be explained. So, see, one of the arguments given when we teach why did India not experience a scientific revolution in the 17th century the way West did was, despite the fact that Indians had done a lot of explorations, we keep claiming about having an Aryabhat, a Varamihir, and so on, and so much of Ayurveda, Charak Samhita, Sushruta Samhita, why did we not indulge in it? It's probably because too much of ritualization happened. If we were to read only plainly as science, it would have made sense. So, in that sense, if you look at Shilpa Shastra, if you look at Varamihir's, whole document on it, or his Pancha Siddhantika, he is looking at both astrology and astronomy. Very interesting. Panch Siddhantika, if you look at astrology, astronomy, Roma Shastra, astrology, and astronomy, they're trying to understand stars also. They're trying to understand um, uh, in what way we benefit with the placement of planets. Today, we understand all this better because we know astronomy much better than what it was at that point in time. But sometimes I felt that if too much of ritualization had not happened and there was a simple scientific exchange of things, things may have been better. But ritualization may have helped in one way. It has actually preserved the knowledge because you consider it so religious and you don't want to taint it at all. You preserve it as it were. So it has come down to us. The Vedas have come down. Once they were compiled in, I say, 500 BCE. They remained largely untainted, though other texts, sutras and smritis do find some kind of a change. But if you want, if you look at it, you must also take a look at Shilpa Shastra to understand, because there is a logic, a very fine logic given everywhere, but it does get ritualized. मतलब even altar कैसे बनाया जाए, उसमें भी ritualization हो जाता है. And you feel that once you ritualize it, you invoke the deities, you call the deities, and they come up for protection. And they come as they assure that there is going to be a success in a project. So, well, you are an architect, you are a scientist in that matter, in that sense. So, you stick to the subject, but out of sheer curiosity to find out what is the astrological aspect around it would be great fun. It's
Yeah,
fun.
actually, I was looking into the geometry also because it leads one into another thing, like the triangle as a Shakti and the square as. So it is a very, as I said, like it's a very, very intense and very dense subject, and even the sounds associated with all these aspects, like it's really very interesting. But after a point, you find it you're lost because your knowledge is very limited and you don't have people who can complement with those questions. Mm, so
You are really bringing in the aspect, opening up a new discipline where the two can be, understood simultaneously. But I'm sure, and now that you've given me food for thought, let me think about it. I'm sure there'll be texts that explain. But like
Yeah, that
astronomy,
will be great. Yeah.
there are texts. If there's, I've just forgotten the name of the author who's talked about the planetary situations. He's a scientist himself, and he studied the Vedas and has given a fantastic as well. The name will come back to me. I think I'll communicate with Chandani and pass the name. There are some scholars who are attempting to do that, not in the context of art architecture. I'm not too sure about, but in the context of understanding astrology and astronomy, I know that there have been scholars who have worked heavily on it. They have worked. There are scholars who are talking about consciousness, linkages of consciousness with this. There are many such scholars. Art architecture, I'm not too sure about it, but there's a possibility Shilpa Shastra study of that gives us some kind of a clue.
Yeah.
There may be way, but ahead of scientific disciplines, they were scientific disciplines, and uh, the attempt was to preserve that knowledge, so probably they got intertwined with religion and ritual performances.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Professor Sahgal, I must say that we have gone now, I think, 50 minutes past our deadline. And
Yeah.
I think people would not have stopped if I don't jump in and be the bad guy right now. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Professor Sahgal. She's been teaching us and enlightening us both through her lecture and an equally long and interesting Q&A session for the past 2.5 hours. So I think if you can switch on your cameras, please do that. Otherwise, वो clapping hand वाला emoji बना दीजिए. This has been fantastic, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so
I
much.
Thank you
enjoyed.
so much. Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. You enjoyed a
Thank you.
lot.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, and that is what counts.
We
An
do have
interested
a
audience, this is what you need.
No, we do have a lecture, ma'am, on our Karma YouTube channel as well. Of course, this was for our workshop audience, but आप YouTube channel पे भी हमारा मैम का lecture देख सकते हैं. We've had the privilege of hosting ma'am before, and we have wonderful books written by her on topics that these have come up in all our regular lectures also, ma'am. And at that time we used to, because we are also taking a few classes, we used to grapple with please reserve these questions for experts. Like you have full-fledged experts on this, and I think now you know that why we wanted you to save those questions. It's been a very, very enlightening session, ma'am. Thank you so much. And we
Thank
will be writing to you tomorrow evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, any comments that you left in the chat box, I've made a note of it in my notes. But if you want to give any follow-up questions, comments, please leave them in the community group. Kal 5 o'clock pe I'll be writing an email to ma'am with my questions. So
Thank you.
thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining in and for your very insightful questions. We'll see you on Saturday with a lecture on the Mughals, on the Delhi Sultans first, and then a couple of guest lectures in the next week. Thank you so much.
Okay. 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 Good night. Good night.